can watch this later if you need to. But okay, so what I'm gonna do is I just wanted to show you guys real quick. Just remind you. Sorry, I'm just a little behind this morning, which is kind of my default, I think, at this point. Okay, so I'm just going to go into the course content page just so that you guys can see. I try to keep everything pretty organized, but one folder that I want you guys to be aware of is my YouTube links. They do have like a lot of info on them that could be helpful, especially like when working from home. Like we're not in the studio, we like you don't have the benefit of like extra supplies or in-person like critiques. So I tried to kind of compile a list of just a few links, and of course there are more that I haven't added yet, but these are kind of like a good starting point if you're stuck, especially like when you're setting up like a still life at home, which is most of your homework. Most of it is you know, me assigning some certain number of objects that I'd like you guys to draw. So I'll go over this, but another thing that I wanted to make you guys aware of, if I haven't already, I think I had mentioned it, but I do have a YouTube page that I am just kind of loading like all of my videos onto. That way you guys can watch them relatively easily, and you don't have to really go into Blackboard too much. So you know, be sure to check that out. And even if you like miss a class too, I try to load all of the Zoom lectures and stuff on here too, so that everything is kind of accessible and in one place. So be sure to check that out if you have any you know, questions or things that you need reviewed that you'd rather not, you know, do over email. So I just wanted to point that out. So I'm going to get started then on the new thing that we're going to do. So what I'm going to go over today is how to draw folds and drapery. So so this is kind of like one of the topics that could be a little bit more intimidating to people, I think, just because fabric is so like soft and there isn't always a ton of structure. Like there are certain types of fabric that if it's just like balled up and sitting in a table, on a table rather, it can be kind of intimidating to try to figure out how to draw something like that. So just have a couple of slides that sort of break down the structure of like fabric folds when they have tension in certain places. So I'll kind of get to that. And unfortunately, obviously we're not in class, but sometimes like I will put drapery or like a piece of fabric or something behind objects. And once you kind of learn how to tackle them and how to draw them, they can be really useful for a backdrop. So I'll get to that in a second, because I definitely do want to go over that with you guys. But so usually when fabric is just kind of lying on a table, as I said, it can be sort of difficult to approach drawing something like that, because as I said, there isn't a ton of structure underneath it. There isn't like a tension point, lots of things, you know, that are sort of intimidating, sort of like an amorphous blob. But for the homework that I'm going to have you guys do, which we'll be doing next week, and you know, for any exercises involving drapery, I will have you guys put a tension point, because it is a little bit easier to draw when you do have some sort of structure to the folds, and you can kind of approach them in a universal sort of way. So as I said here, when fabric is stressed and it's not flat, it's not lying flat, folds happen, they're created, and the folds nearest to the point of stress are smaller and tightly compacted, and as they kind of fall and they you know, get closer to the floor, they widen, and they turn into more of a cone shape, which you can kind of see here. There's some like nice illustrations kind of demonstrating that. So you can kind of see it's like downward gravity here. There are a few different types of folds that I've highlighted here. And you can kind of see, like, these are really great illustrations of some of the different types of folds. And you guys have probably encountered them even in drawing maybe some of the environmental studies that we did. I definitely remember at least one or two of you guys dealing with some pipe folds of like curtains in your house, like if you drew a window as part of your environmental study. So I definitely remember seeing those. I can't remember exactly who it was, but so that, that's just one of the types of pipe fold, and it's sort of like self-explanatory. All of these are kind of self-explanatory in terms of like their shape. The diaper fold, I would say, is probably one of the ones that maybe is a little bit less clear, but essentially it is the type of fold that occurs in between like two tension points. So this diaper fold here has two little points of tension, and then in between that kind of slack, that's what they call the diaper fold. And again, you don't need to necessarily, you don't need to know these types of folds, for anything in Sketch, but I do feel like sometimes it is helpful to kind of know them, or at least be able to identify them, even if it's just by sight, because that can kind of clue you in on how to approach drawing these. So the pipe folds or the drop folds, those are they're very closely related, and those are kind of what you're going to be dealing with in the homework assignment and anything else that you do most likely in fabric in this class. But they're found in hanging fabric, curtains or dresses, any type of fabric that's hanging off of something, and they're cone shaped or tubular. Which again is pretty self-explanatory. And then inert folds, those are those folds that I was talking about, where they're just sort of like, it's maybe a blanket like resting on a table, or a cloth or something like a dish rag resting on a countertop. That would be an inert fold, and essentially they're random kind of folds, and they happen as a result of being dropped onto a surface with no structure underneath. So I think that maybe in this class before the quarantine, I think maybe I used fabric. I can't quite remember. Sometimes all the semesters blur together, but sometimes I will have some like inert folds in the background of objects sort of resting, because they can kind of provide an interesting backdrop if you have a more simple object in front. But anyway, so you might recognize those from class. But and here another couple of good illustrations on just of fabric, hanging fabric, like studies. A lot of people do like little studies of these, like a lot of the old masters did studies of fabric, just like you see here. And that's because as I said, like it can be sort of intimidating to draw. Like they're soft but also structured in a lot of ways, and when you draw convincing fabric, you are getting like the volume of the folds in there, and you are getting like a certain sense of depth and convincing like realism. So being able to draw them well is one of those like kind of technical things that, like, I don't know, I always get impressed when I see artists like on Instagram or whatever, and they're doing like drapery studies. I always kind of find it like really impressive when they can draw fabric really well. Like some people just find it really super interesting, I think, too. And they'll just take some time like looking at it and really studying it. So, and especially with all the different kinds of material, you have a wide range of possibilities. But anyway, here's another little illustration of a couple of points of support on this piece of drapery. And you're getting sort of those pipe folds happening in here, and they're kind of being pulled downwards. You're getting the diaper folds, which are, as it says right here, triangular in shape and fall between 2 points of support. So they've kind of like put a little dotted line down here, and they've sort of put it over like all the contours of the diaper fold. So you can kind of see it's sort of like a cross contour line, just kind of making its way across the surface and going in and out accordingly. So here's some tips on drawing fabric folds. I found this like great. I don't think I did. I found this artist on, I think it was DeviantArt. It was online somewhere. I could probably find the name. I'm surprised it didn't put it, but he had this, or she actually, I think it was a woman, she had this really great breakdown of drawing fabric folds, and she had all of these like little illustrations that she did. So I pulled a couple of really helpful ones. So this one, this is sort of just like a directional sketch where she has put the points of tension, as you can see, there are two, and she's drawn like arrows indicating the pull that's happening on all of these folds, which I thought was kind of an interesting way to do it, because you're not only like getting the kind of overall shape of this, but you're getting the direction that these folds are pulling in too, which is really helpful when you go to render the volume. But a couple of just like tips here when beginning, just try to simplify by finding the main shapes and keep in mind the direction of the strokes. So when I show you guys the little time lapse that I did, you'll see that like one of the first things that I do is just get the major shapes, which is generally how I advise you guys to do most of your drawing in this class, is to start general and then get more specific. Yeah, so keep in mind the direction of the strokes and find the main shapes. And I said try to stay away from tiny creases and in little details until the end. And this holds true for a lot of things in this class, but particularly with fabric, just kind of getting the overall main shapes down are important, because I think that sometimes you can get really caught up in doing those little creases. And I feel like if you can get the general shape down first, it tends to make a more successful drawing rather than getting caught up in tiny little creases first, because then next thing you know, you've started on a little tiny crease, and next thing you know, like it's the end of class and you've only done one little area. So stick to basic at first. So this person sort of labeled the different types of folds that they found, and essentially they kind of broke them up into letters. So they have a C, I, and S strokes. So like just like the letters in the alphabet, they've kind of identified that a lot of folds take on these three basic shapes. So you can see like the S curve, and you guys will see that. You're probably familiar with that little S at the bottom of drapery, especially like curtains or a dress or anything like that. But those are a little bit more rare. They tend to only occur at the end of fabric folds. But what are really common are what they classify as I folds or strokes, which are just like straight kind of lines, or C shapes. And I thought that this was like a really astute way of identifying these. But you can see the C shape is sort of like a, it's all different stages, I guess, of the letter C, you could say. This one is kind of folded and stretched out pretty well. And then these are like a little bit more mild. So this is a kind of wide set C shape stroke. But those are a few like really good ways to think about the shapes in fabric, and also really helpful. So another thing, vary the size and length of your strokes. So short, long, narrow, small, medium, large, all of those tend to occur. So just a quick word about that. When you guys do the homework, so I'm not going to have you guys do anything too crazy when you do the homework. So I'm only going to require 1 point of tension. And if you guys are feeling really ambitious, you could certainly do 2 or even 3. And I'll explain how to do that in a second. So you won't see as much variation if you're working with something like this. You're mostly going to see just like I shapes, and the occasional S curve at the bottom, but you're not going to see a ton of variation unless you start to draw something with like 2 or more points of tension, or like if you've got a bunch of layered fabrics on top of one another. But the homework is going to be pretty basic, and you won't see a ton of variation, but these are good guidelines for down the road if you get really interested in drawing fabric, or you have a more complex shape that you want to tackle. These are some really good guidelines. Yeah, so that's a word on the variation of the sizes and strokes. And you can use sighting techniques to get proportions and angles get them accurate. So if you guys remember back to like some of the beginning weeks of class, we did the citing and the measuring stuff. And this is something that you can do kind of one of two ways, like as we sort of discussed in class, but you can certainly like measure out everything very strictly, and it tends to take a long time. The way that I tend to do it is I will do like a basic sketch or something, and then I'll go back in after and I'll measure accordingly just to make sure that I have the correct proportions. And the more that you draw and the better that you get at sort of like eyeballing things, the more accurate you'll realize that you start to become. But at first it is a really good idea to, you know, even if you don't want to start out by just like doing all the measuring stuff and like holding your pencil up, to do a basic sketch first, and if you do, go back and check. But they can be really useful in drawing. This can be really useful in drawing drapery as well, because sometimes you will have certain angles that may be a little bit tricky. So like you could easily hold your pencil up and just kind of like hold it right along some of these folds, like especially the eye and even some of the like gentle C curves. You could theoretically angle with your pencil and kind of transfer that to your paper. So those are a couple of further ways to really like emphasize your accuracy. And then finally, two things to remember. The basic shape of a fold is a cone. It says in a cone, but it's typo. And then establishing small landmarks to keep you in the correct place is really helpful too. So that goes for like any kind of drawing, but like making mental or visual notes of, okay, like this is here, and it's, you know, close to like this leaf or like whatever you're drawing, and sometimes even like counting. So like sometimes I'll go in and I'll count, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4 folds on the right side, and that's really helpful too. So anything that you can kind of use to keep your place is going to be it's going to be helpful. So once you've got the basic sketch down, so like theoretically when you start a drawing like this, you'll have something that looks like either this top drawing here or this one once you start. And once you do that, then you want to establish the volume. So, and this sort of remains true for most things that you draw in this class. So things to remember are, you know, creating the illusion of volume of folds is similar to creating the illusion of volume in most objects. So you're going to have your main source of light hitting the highlight areas, those are going to be the brightest. And then you will have your cast shadow. So those are going to be like the shadows that you see next to the folds where they kind of like are concave, and they're going to be typically really dark. But then you are going to have your reflected light in some areas, and you're going to have some like core shadow up on the piece of fabric that's kind of rounded and coming the closest to you. So like that's exemplified really well right here in this piece. You can see that the highlight is here, and then they have this like little piece of core shadow, and that's like a kind of band. And then there's a little bit of reflected light here, and this eventually goes into like a darker cast shadow. But the light source, as I said in yellow, is coming from probably the left side, but it looks like it is sort of all over. But they definitely have a bright light shining on this like lighter colored piece of fabric. And as a result, you're seeing some cast shadows in there, and since it is a light piece of fabric, you're definitely going to see some reflected light too. So just sort of identifying where those areas are, like you would if this were a normal drawing. If this were just like a basic sphere, you could identify the cast shadow, the overall shadow, with the core wherever that would be, so that like darker band, and then any reflected light that was occurring. So again, it's like similar to if you were drawing a white sphere, you would probably see a little bit of reflected light coming up off the surface onto your object. And again, that's really subtle, but it does make a difference, and it's something that I identified as really helping when I was doing my time-lapse video for you guys, which I'll show in a couple minutes. So these are just some notes on this. So yeah, and as I said, like part of the fold comes toward the viewer while the sides recede, and identify the most prominent folds first, their light and shadow area, And if the highlights are hard to see, look for the direction of the light source. And again, I sort of highlighted that over here. And when folds are in the shadow of another fold, the shadow areas have areas of reflected light. So it's a little typo there, but they do have areas of reflected light. So just kind of making yourself attuned to those areas is going to be super helpful. And the cast shadows also have subtle gradations of tone that may be hard to see. So viewing these from a closer point of view is something that's really helpful. And of course, that would apply more if we were in class and I had a setup going. So a lot of the times if my students are having trouble, I will advise them to actually go up and look really closely, like actually get out of their chair and go and look at the hanging fabric, because it can be helpful. And sometimes you can miss things like, you know, if I'm not wearing my glasses, sometimes it's really hard for me to see the little subtle areas of reflected light. So getting up and actually physically looking at your object really close up and really identifying all of those areas can be super helpful. And it's something that you guys shouldn't forget to do when you set up your own still life. And then finally, I've just got like a few examples of master works, particularly studies of drapery. So we got Da Vinci here, Durer. This is drawing, just a study of drapery. And you can see these guys were like obviously amazing at these, at drawing, but they definitely took the time to study drapery and to study the way that fabric folds and moves and behaves. And you can see that these are mostly, with the exception of maybe this one, they seem to be just like your typical soft fabric. It doesn't seem that any of these are really like a satiny material or highly reflective material. But when you do have like a shiny material, your highlights and your shadows are a lot more prominent. So actually had, let me see if I can find it. Actually had a picture, let's see. I had a picture that I wanted to show you guys. I thought it was in this slideshow. I have a lot of PowerPoints on my computer. All right, let's see. Okay. Well, I don't know where it is, but essentially it was a picture of a couple different types of fabric, and one was more like diffuse material, so something softer like wool or sweatshirt material is obviously going to diffuse the light in a more even way, and there aren't going to be a lot of sharp highlights on there. If you have a shiny material, if you've got like patent leather or something with a sheen to it, making those divisions between light and dark sharper are going to create a shiny effect. And that's something that we'll cover more in depth when we get to like glass and metallic objects, which will be next week. But those like really sharp divisions between shadow and highlight, that's really how you get really kind of crisp material. And like that's how you get the difference, is like really kind of emphasizing this. So let me see. Let's see. No, I don't have it in here. Okay. So I have a quick video that I want to play for you guys. So so I did a time lapse of drawing drapery. So I tackled two different types of fabric. So one was a white sweatshirt, and that was hanging on the left, which again you'll see in a second. And the other one was like a navy blue and black and like kind of a cream color striped wool scarf, and they were both hanging like next to each other on two hooks. And I put a light source on them, and I drew them And I wanted to draw a couple of different materials so that you guys could kind of see the difference. Well, I guess they're not super different, but different colors. So one is really dark, one is really light, and one has pattern on it and one doesn't. So I just kind of wanted to highlight the difference between that. And just a quick word on this, I used charcoal for this. So I used for the majority of this drawing, I did just vine charcoal. So that like really light, very easily breakable charcoal that I gave you guys in your kit. That is what I used for like, I would say 85% of this drawing. And then 15% I used like some charcoal pencils, which you guys may or may not have. It depends. I didn't give any out as like for this class. They weren't something that I had distributed yet. So some of you guys may have them if you do like drawing as just like a hobby or like something that you really like to do. So I would recommend, especially if you're working in a smaller format like I was, I would recommend using charcoal pencil for like a smaller format drawing. If you can draw larger, then just using the compressed charcoal stick should be enough, especially if you like sharpen it a little bit. You can usually sharpen those to a little bit of a point. If you have like a sharp knife or something, you can just kind of sharpen it that way. But I found that the vine charcoal, that really soft kind of willowy dark gray, was very appropriate for like the majority of this drawing, and especially because it was so mobile. But yeah, so I'll play this and I'll just kind of like narrate over it. But essentially I started off by getting like my major shapes, and you can see I have the two different pieces of fabric, and the lighter one is on the left and the darker one is on the right. And one thing that was like really important to me that it sort of kept getting lost was the major folds, especially on the piece on the left. I felt like they kind of kept getting lost, and I think it was sort of that material, that really soft charcoal. Everything kind of gets sort of wiped away really easily. Also, that thing that looks like a brace on my hand is really amazing. I don't know if I mentioned it to this class or my other class. It's like a smudge guard. So it's like essentially a 2-fingered glove, and it just goes on your two last fingers, and it like covers your whole wrist and side of your hand, so that you don't get those like smudge marks on your paper, because sometimes your hand will like deposit some like oil onto the surface and it will really stain it. And you guys know what I'm talking about. If this has happened to you, it's like one of the most frustrating things. And I got this on Amazon like before, I think it was like before the pandemic situation, and it was like $6, and I got 2 of them. But it looks like I have like an unidentified illness, but I just wanted to let you guys know it's just a smudge guard, and I would definitely recommend / send anybody the link that's interested, because they're amazing. So that is what that is. So the nice thing about the charcoal, which you guys are welcome to use charcoal for this assignment, which again, I'll explain in a second, but you could also use graphite. I like using the charcoal because it is really mobile, and you can get like a dark, medium, and light gray quickly on the page, like a lot quicker in my opinion than pencil, because I find that pencil, and you guys have experienced it too, it's like a waxy sort of buildup, and it does feel more permanent, and it kind of in a way is like more permanent on a surface. You can't just like wipe it away and smudge it like super easily unless you go really, really light, or you're using like a very high grade B pencil that's like super soft. But I just find that generally charcoal works for me personally better when I'm doing drapery. So again, you guys can use any material for this, whether it is charcoal, whether it is graphite. Even if you wanted to use Sharpie marker, I'd be okay with it, as long as you kind of built up your different values appropriately and everything. But so like, I think I mentioned this, but one of the things that kept happening to me was I kept kind of losing that stripe of value on those folds, and that I found to be really important. Um, and I had to go back in later and sort of re-emphasize it. But okay. So that is like a really fast, obviously, version of drawing drapery. So I will go ahead and explain your homework assignment, and then have one more quick thing to go over, and then let you guys ask any questions. So the homework for this week is, as usual, in your assignments folder. And it's titled Drapery Assignment, and I have the due date here, 4/21, which is a week from today. And I'm just going to click into here. So as I said before completing this assignment, just watch this slideshow that we already went over, and watch the video titled Drawing Fabric. So your homework is to like find an interesting piece of fabric, whatever that may be, if that's like a jersey that has a cool pattern on it, or really anything. You're not limited. But find an interesting piece of fabric, and I said this could be an article of clothing, a towel, anything, and hang it on something so that tension is created at the top and folds appear. So this is an image of the two pieces of fabric that I hung on my wall. So I just have those little like eye hooks, but you can use, if you have like coat hangers on your door, or if you have like somewhere on your wall, like a command hook that you can hang stuff, just use that. Doesn't have to be anything crazy. But what I do want, like the requirement is that there has to be some sort of tension, holding it in place. And some people like to, and you saw it in the slideshow as well, but some people like to do 2 points of tension. So sometimes, like theoretically, I could have just hung one piece up here on this hook, and if I got rid of this darker piece of fabric on the right, I could theoretically hang the rest of the white sweatshirt on there, and then that would have 2 pieces of tension. But I really only want you guys to have one, just so that you have definite folds that are happening and being created. And then position a light on it to create dramatic darks and lights, and as I noted, it'll make it easier for you to draw this way. And that goes for any drawing assignment in this class. When you light it up with bright light, you're going to see the shadows a lot more clearly, and especially with something like fabric, it's important that you're able to see clearly. And then just draw the fabric based on your setup in pencil, charcoal, marker, whatever you want. I am pretty open. But your setup, it should look, I mean, it doesn't have to look exactly like this, but this is a really good example of a dramatic light source hitting an object, and you can see the definite folds and shadows happening. And so that's in the drapery, in the course content, and that's in the assignments folder. And I'll just click into it again, and then you just click on this, and then that'll bring you to the forum where you just click on this, and you guys will just post your pictures of your drawing as normal. And one more thing I just wanted to go over, and this is a quick thing, but important, I think. So normally, like, if this were a normal situation, would be in class, and I would set up a piece of drapery for you guys to draw like all week. But I did link this YouTube video that is really helpful. So I just wanted to kind of quickly like scrub through this video. It's short, but it gives you some really great tips on setting up a still life at home. And I'm just going to mute the volume because we can kind of just like, as I said, scrub through it. But essentially, you want to just pick whatever you're going to draw. And then step 1 is to kind of create a background. So this person happened to be using like a fabric background. Yeah, I'm not saying you guys don't obviously have to do this because you're drawing fabric. That's going to be the subject. But you know, this would be a good place to kind of set something up where this person has it. They have it just like on a blank wall. So especially if you're doing a dark piece of fabric, pinning it to a blank wall and then just hitting it with a light source is going to be like a really good choice. But then you can see that they kind of get into the light source. So I'll just kind of let this play for a second. You guys can watch. So typically I just say use one light source, make it easy on yourself. If you feel like you want a challenge, and if you feel like you kind of want, yeah, I mean, I guess a challenge would be the best way to describe it. You can use two light sources, and that will create a different light pattern on your objects. Obviously, it will create, especially if you have one light source like further back, it'll create a more subtle or more dramatic reflected light. So you can see they're kind of pointing this away from the object, and I'm guessing that one side they're going to put toward the object. You can certainly, okay, I want to just say, I'm not going to like formally recommend that you do this. They say that right here. Maybe just don't cover your light with anything. I think that that's like a little bit too risky. I did it like once or twice when I was an undergrad, and I don't know, it just feels weird. Like my mom always used to tell me not to cover like a lamp with anything, even if it was like anyway, it doesn't matter. Don't do this, please. Unless you're very, very careful. So yeah, I think that's like a plastic bag, and I just like, I don't support that. So obviously I would prefer you guys don't take reference photos. And that's sort of like it on that video, but I'd prefer you guys don't take reference photos. Obviously, this is a weird situation for everybody. So if you're going to take reference photos, you know, you're going to do it, and that's kind of your prerogative. But, you know, ideally, we are working from life. I would like you guys to work from life as much as possible. So definitely reference that video to get yourself a really good setup going. It's a good video to watch, and there are plenty more. Like obviously, you guys know YouTube is a huge resource, so you can definitely click around on there and maybe find something that's more pertinent to setting up like a fabric still life. But yeah, so so that is my my sort of 2 cents on whoops. That's my my presentation on fabric. Does anybody have any questions about that? Any questions about the homework? Anything like that? Okay. So as I said, the homework will be due a week from today. So that is the 21st. And I'm actually going to just stop my